My name is Jen. I'm 36 years old. I was a Unification Church member and I am shunned.
All right, Jen. So, how did you come to be in the Unification Church in the first place? Is
I
something you were
was,
born in?
yes, I was born into the church. So my parents both joined when they were young in the 1970s. My mother joined, I believe, when she was 20 years old, and my father was probably about 18. And they were matched by Reverend Moon, and then they were married in a blessing ceremony in 1982 in Madison Square Garden. So that's where a lot of people are familiar with the Unification Church, is their mass weddings.
Okay.
Mm.
Actually, I have heard that, and I have
Okay.
heard that. I guess Reverend Moon was the one. Did he have to bless all unions?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think in the early days, it may have been that people got to choose their spouses, but there were so few of them that it might have been like, well, there's three girls and four guys, so you go here and you go here. But for the most part, everybody had to go through a matching ceremony with Reverend Moon. That changed when I was 15 for a short time. He decided that he was no longer going to match the second generation, and that was going to be handed off to the parents. But that became more of a clamoring for political and social status in the church. And I think that Moon must have realized that there was potential for him and his family to kind of lose power. And so he stepped back in again when I was 20 and started doing matchings, I believe, until he passed away. But yeah, if you wanted to get hitched, you went through Moon.
Okay. All right. I'm sure that that made for some difficult unions at times.
I think that that's an understatement. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I'm
you have
sure it
to
is.
imagine. So the theology of the church, to kind of back up a little bit, is that the fall of man was a sexual sin. So they believed that Lucifer seduced Eve before she had come of age. They believed that she was 16 or so underaged, a minor. And it was a spiritual sexual union. And then once Eve had had sex with Lucifer spiritually, she, by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she was able to understand God's plan better, and that Adam was supposed to be her husband. So then she seduced Adam. And so all sin is based in sexual sin, and it all came from Eve. And so in order to restore humanity, you had to cut off the lineage of Satan. We were all descended from Satan prior to Reverend Moon coming back as the second coming of Jesus.
Of course.
And you had to engraft yourself onto the Messiah's lineage. And so, allegedly, the way that that happened in the early days of the church is you actually had sex with Moon. So there was I'm going to mispronounce this in Korean, but I believe there was a ceremony called pigurun, which was called womb cleansing. And so women had to have sex with Moon in order to engraft onto the Messiah's lineage. And then they would go and have sex with their husbands. And I guess when Moon came to America, he realized that wasn't so cool. So that stopped. And there's there's a lot of hearsay about whether or not that truly did happen. But in the Unification Church, when my parents were blessed after a separation period, so a period of however long Moon said you had to stay apart after you were married, they did something called the 3 day ceremony, which is 3 days of prescribed sexual rites in front of a picture of Reverend Moon with various positions to demonstrate, like, Eve being restored by Adam and also dominated by Adam properly again. And that was supposed to then engraft you onto the Messiah's lineage. Problematically, a lot of these unions were done to complete strangers. So my parents didn't really know each other when they were matched to each other. They didn't really like each other. It was a bad marriage from the beginning. There were marriages across nations. So there were people who didn't even speak the same language, who had to figure out how to communicate and then how to create a family. So yeah, it was the basis for a lot of difficult marriages. And, we were taught self-sacrifice in the church, that your happiness didn't really matter. We were sacrificing for humanity. And so unhappiness in a marriage didn't really matter. So it was a total mind fuck for a lot of people. And just the language, the loaded language of, like, you are receiving the blessing from the Messiah. That's tough for a lot of people, because I think that there was a lot of guilt for them if they felt unhappy. And additionally, to add to it, in the church, if you had negative feelings or if you doubted anything that Reverend Moon said, you were said to be creating a common base with Satan where evil spirit world could invade. So you had to really close your mind to any kind of thoughts that were against what Reverend Moon said. So for people who were struggling, I think that they thought that it was their fault. A lot of women, especially, were told that it was their fault if their marriage was abusive. There were women who were like domestically abused and were told, well, you're just, it's your fault that you haven't created like the right spiritual standard, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it was, I think that there are a lot of people that grew up in really, really rough households because of that. And then to add sort of the cherry on top, a lot of people worked for the church or had left their college experience behind in order to join the church and therefore didn't have many skills. So there was a lot of families, mine included, that really struggled financially. And, financial struggles, period, can break a couple. But when you have that, you have, language and cultural barriers, or, just a stranger that you don't really like or not compatible with, those are really difficult domestic circumstances for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think they say that one of the leading causes of divorce is financial struggle.
Right.
Isn't it interesting though how these, high control groups, Jehovah's Witnesses set up marriage to fail too. It's two people coming together, and maybe they did choose each other, but they're chaperoned all the time. They can never be alone. They can never really be who they are. They don't even know who they are, and they get married young, oftentimes. But isn't it interesting how these groups, you would think that they would want strong families, but they set up the families to fail?
I think that they say that they want strong families, and I don't know what it was like in the Jehovah's Witnesses. I know that you had a group of leaders, but you didn't have the originator of the group alive during at least your experience with us. And I think with other high control groups where there's that charismatic leader that's still the figurehead. The idea is to break down the nuclear family bonds, because when you create those kinds of, really, essentially, the attachment models that are problematic, you're able to then connect the person to the leader more and to the structure more. If you had strong family units, people would be like, peace, I'm going to go have a great time with my family. I'm not going to do all this shit that you're telling me to do. But in the church, what our parents were supposed to do, and mine didn't, but a number of them did, is you were supposed to leave your children in what amounted to an orphanage for anywhere between a couple of months to years, so that you could go out on missions. And my mom would tell me this when I was growing up. She's like, yeah, I was supposed to leave you behind and go on a mission, but I couldn't do that. Like, as soon as I became a mother, I couldn't. But there are friends that I have that they grew up in something called Jacob's House. And these were basically, Unification Church nurseries all over the country. And some of them didn't see their parents until they were 2 or 3 years old. There's even records of children dying in these nurseries because they were so poorly staffed that there was just neglect. So
that's terrible.
It is terrible. It's heartbreaking. But to me, what it does is it undermines the fundamental basis of the Unification Church, where they say that they're all about creating these ideal families, and yet their actions were specifically designed to break down the family ties so that you were more aligned with the leader, with Moon,
and
than you were with your own family.
Right. And that's what I was getting at, is they preach happy families. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses, we had the family life book. It was how to create a happy family life. They preach and they go out and they tell everyone that we have the key to family happiness. But all along, of course, like you're saying, they're breaking down the family bonds. They want you to be bonded and attached to them. They need you to need them. Although we didn't have an individual leader, we really just had this nebulous Jehovah guy. Obviously it was God, but most people, if you really listen to how they talk about it, they conflate Jehovah or God with the governing body or the organization itself.
Right.
And so it's really serving that organization, or just whatever you're told through Watchtower Corporation or whatever it is, you're serving that leader.
Yeah.
Or just the leader who sits before you, whether it's your mom or dad,
Yeah.
or elders in the congregation. There's always somebody that you're taught to look to outside of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we had a hierarchy like that too. We called it having a central figure. So, for example, so in Unification Church theology, they have all these diagrams. If you were to open up like a divine principle, which was our sort of, it's not even a version of the Bible. It's like, so Moon said there's the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then Unification Church is the completed testament. So it's sort of like, he believed he was finishing Jesus's mission. He believed that when he was 16, Jesus came to him on a mountain while he was praying at Easter and said, "You need to finish my mission. My mission was not to die on the cross. It was to get married and have an ideal family. Because then, you would have broken off the lineage of Satan and then God's lineage could have come about." But anyway, in the divine principle, there's something called the four position foundation. And it's this sort of pseudoscientific looking graph where like God is this circle up here, and then there's man and woman. And there are these little like arrows of like love going from God to man, and then man returning love, and then to the woman, and then like man to woman. And then at the bottom is the child, right? But what this also sort of was supposed to represent was how all relationships are supposed to function. So it could be like the way that your mind and body are supposed to function completely centered on God, or the way that you're supposed to relate to your parents. And so it was always a hierarchy, and we called them vertical relationships. You had to focus on your vertical relationships. You had to cut off horizontal relationships, which was like friendships and crushes. You weren't really supposed to have strong bonds like that. And so, we had a central figure, or my parents would have been my central figures growing up, right? But then they had their leaders that they reported to. And then there were state leaders and continental leaders and regional leaders. So we definitely had that hierarchical body as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, even in the Bible, Jehovah's Witnesses would say there's, Jehovah, then Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and then Jesus was the head of the man who was head of the woman. And then, the children came at the bottom. But I'm just, they always had a hierarchy somewhere.
Yeah.
Everyone was being told what their position or role was.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, we had various levels of like blessed couples. So the original like disciples of Moon were the 36 blessed couples, and then I think there was like the 72, and so there was all of these numbers based on numerology. And so there was like 777, and then the 1800 blessed couples, and my parents were part of the Madison Square Garden blessing, which was like I think 2075, and then there was another one of 5,000 in Korea. So the smaller the number, the more inner circle you were, and the higher up in the hierarchy you were. And as a second generation, if you were the child of a 36 blessed couple, you were also higher up in the hierarchy. So technically, because I was born of the Madison Square Garden blessing, it would have been much harder for me to get matched to, let's say, like an 1800 couple child, because they would have been a little bit higher up in the caste system.
Oh, wow. Okay, so let's get then to a little bit of how did this, so your parents came into this later in life, you were born into it.
Mm-hmm.
So for you being born into it, how does it make you see the world as a child? What's your worldview growing up in that church?
So I grew up kind of close to a church community up until I was about 5. So I only went to church really like on Sundays, and I wasn't really encouraged to play with other children, because when I was maybe 4 years old, I was playing on the neighborhood playground with my friend Susie, and we're running home. And I go, "Susie, I'm better than you because I'm a blessed child and you're not." And when her parents found out and my parents found out, I wasn't allowed to play with outside kids anymore. And then when we moved, so kind of to attach to that, my mother indoctrinated me from a very young age. Like she liked to use Disney movies as sort of the parables to understand divine principle. So she would tell me, "Jenny, you are like a princess. You are like Aurora in Sleeping Beauty, but you're a princess in exile. So you're like Briar Rose, right?" And nobody can find out about your secret identity because Maleficent, as Satan, is looking for you and trying to attack you. And you always have to obey your central figures like the fairies in Sleeping Beauty, right? And Aurora would have gotten everything she wanted if she had just obeyed the fairies, right? But because she went behind their backs and met Prince Philip, then Maleficent was able to attack and invade and put the entire world into a sleep, and become this giant monster. And so for me growing up, there was this very real threat of like this giant dragon monster was going to attack me if I told anybody who I was. And so I grew up with this very strong sense of a secret identity. And then when I was about 6 years old, my parents moved away from the closest church community. We were, I think, about 2 hours south. And my parents were a little bit interesting as kind of a side note in that they both finished their education in the church. So my father was getting his PhD when we moved down to Charlottesville, Virginia. And his PhD, his education sort of took us all over the world. So we didn't grow up in like a single community. We were more like military brats in that we were very nomadic. And so being 2 hours away from the closest church member meant that I was very isolated growing up. And I really developed this kind of us and them mentality because I went to public school. But my mother was very much like, you are in the world, but you are not of it. That is the outside world. That is the fallen world. And that's the language that we used. And the kids that you play with at Sunday school, those are your best, those are your friends. Blessed children are your friends. And so I wasn't really allowed to develop friendships. I wasn't really allowed to develop any kind of strong relationships with teachers. I remember when I was in second grade, my mom came home from the parent-teacher conference with my teacher, Mrs. Sams, who was wonderful. She encouraged me to read. She'd recommend books to me. Sometimes she'd be like, let's see who can finish this book first. I loved her because I got so much attention from her. Whereas my mother was very much trying to develop her own mission to witness. And I was the oldest of 5 kids. So there wasn't a lot of time for me, to connect with her. But anyway, so my mom came home from this parent-teacher conference and goes, Mrs. Sams relies on you way too much. Your relationship with her is dangerous. And so there was very much this systematic cutting me off from any kind of support system outside of the church. But additionally, which was kind of problematic because we only went to church on holy days now. We didn't even go on Sundays. There's 8 holy days, I think, on the church calendar. So I got to see kids 8 days out of the year. So not even once a month. To the point where I became kind of an outsider in the church as well, because a lot of these kids grew up in these very insular communities all over the country. So Washington, D.C. is one of those communities. There's some out in California. New York City is one. And so I would, after a couple of years of this, I was too scared to even go to Sunday school on the days that we would go into the Washington, D.C. church, because I was basically shunned by these kids because they didn't know who I was.
Wow.
I was this unknown.
Did you all have a term for outsiders?
Yeah, outside people or fallen people.
Oh,
Yep.
fallen people. So
Yeah.
whereas we had worldly, you all had fallen.
Fallen. Yeah, they were part
the
of Satan's
blessed people, and they were the fallen people.
Yeah, so there's a couple of terms. Second generation and blessed children are sort of used interchangeably. Now there's third generation, but they would still be considered blessed children. Okay. As a sort of side mindfuck, though, kids who were brought into the church, let's say kids who had been born outside, whose parents joined, they were not second generation. They were called Jacob's children or Jacob's child. You were a Jacob's child if your parents joined when you were 10. And you couldn't marry a second generation. So you were like the lowest caste in the church.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So these poor kids, they sort of had to find ways to ride the line between they were still outsiders very much, but they were also in the church. And some of them, even if they were, a month old, brought into the church, they were still considered of Satan's lineage. And so the only people that they could marry would be another Jacob's child. So. And
then if 2 Jacob's children got together eventually and had their own children, would they forever be Jacob's children?
So their children would have been second generation.
Okay, they would be okay to be second generation at that point.
Their children would be second generation, yeah, but their children probably couldn't marry, like if I had had kids in the church, couldn't have married my kids. So even if we'd all grown up together and we all had babies around the same time, their children would still be in a lower caste than mine. Yeah.
Oh, you see how you're even isolated from each other inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Wow. Totally.
And like, how do you know? How do you know if you don't know all these people? How do you wear a badge? Is there some way of dress? Is there something that helps people to identify where you fall in this caste system?
No, I think you just hold it all in your head. I mean, eventually you're indoctrinated into it, right? Yeah. I mean, because again, I remember from a very young age being indoctrinated into like, you are a blessed child and this is what it means. And God has waited for 6,000 biblical years for, people like you to be born.
A lot of pressure.
None whatsoever. Well, and, in terms of pressure, our parents believed that we would be perfect. And part of our theology is that you grow into perfection. And I remember one time I had a really hard time at school, because of the isolation. I remember I was crying and my mom was like trying to sort of shame me into going to school that day. And she goes, blessed couples, we thought that when we had blessed children, that our children would be perfect. And some of us believed that that meant that our children wouldn't even cry as babies. And I was like,
that is rough.
Yeah. So can you imagine these parents like having this expectation that your infant that has just come out of the womb is going to be so perfect and beatific that they're not going to cry about their needs? So yeah, there was a lot of mind fuck of like, you should have been perfect and you're supposed to be perfect and perfect is attainable, but we don't know what it looks like. And it's a moving goalpost. So have fun with that.
It sounds like, so the common refrain of the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses is that they never felt like they were good enough.
Oh, I mean,
how could you ever feel that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's something that a lot of us feel too, is that just that not good enough was definitely a refrain. We would be indoctrinated in workshops with like hours long lectures over the summer. And one of the most common things was that, we are not worthy to be receiving the blessings. We are not worthy to be in the presence of the Messiah. And the first time that I ever went to a camp workshop, I was 8 years old. So my mom put me on this bus with a bunch of strangers. I drove 8 hours on this bus up to New York to the Catskill Mountains. I didn't know anybody. And it was a week-long workshop of mostly lectures, just indoctrination from like the time that you wake up until the time you go to bed. There was some arts and crafts and some canoeing and stuff like that, but mostly lectures,
For a week.
Lot of it.
Wow.
For a week. Yeah. And I mean, I was young enough too that like I didn't shower all week because nobody told me to shower because I was 8 years old, and that I was just like used to parents being like, okay, here's the structure, now it's shower time, now brush your teeth. And I was just so out to sea that I was the stinky kid.
Hey, somebody's got to be.
I volunteered to be the stinky kid.
Wow, that's very intense for a child to have to take on all of this.
Yeah.
It's something that, Jehovah's Witness children have to take on the end of the world. The world is going to end, and it's all up to you and us to save the world. And, you all are having to take on this pressure of trying to be perfect and, fix this lineage issue or fix this whole thing with Satan. And it's just, that's so much.
Well, and it's so
you should
funny.
Be playing with toys and out having fun.
I know. And it's funny because I never really thought of the Unification Church as being an apocalyptic group, but the more research that I did, I realized that Moon did actually speak about, we are in the last days. And that was a phrase that I heard all the time, but there was actually the threat of World War III, that if we don't accomplish our mission, if we don't move the providence forward, and if we don't hit whatever these vague milestones are, World War III will happen. And of course, in the Cold War, that was very resonant to our parents. And, because their grandparents had grown up in the World War II era. So I came to understand that much like the Jehovah's Witnesses, we were an apocalyptic group. We just didn't use the word the apocalypse. And, additionally, we were taught that it was our job to heal God's broken heart. So we had this very like impotent, sad God. And so it was like the ultimate version of parentification of children, because if God is the ultimate parent, which is what we believed, it was our job to tend to his like broken heart and his emotions. And that is definitely not something that any child should be raised to believe.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that resonates. Are you making Jehovah's heart glad, or are you making it sad?
Yeah.
Wow, Jehovah's he's so petty and he's so petty that, I as a child could tell a lie and I've just broken God's heart. Like, that's
Yes.
terrible.
Yes. So I have this very distinct memory. I was 14. I was an assistant counselor at a workshop, and I had gone through some like super indoctrination training in order to be an assistant counselor. But these two 12-year-olds came up to me. They were my group members, sobbing after a lecture, just like completely inconsolable. And I'm like, oh my God, did you guys get hurt? Are you bleeding? What's going on? And finally, they're able to tell me, God is so sad and all I do is hurt him. And I'm like, you're 12. What could you have done to hurt God? And
Anything.
anything. And, I sort of reflected on myself at that point too, because I was not living the life of a good Unification Church member. And we can get to that later. But I really reflected back on me. I was like, wow, if these 12-year-olds who really couldn't do anything other than like fight with their siblings to break God's heart, how much worse am I? Because, I'm so off center. This is one of the terms that we used. So yeah, I mean, it was just such pressure for kids growing up to be perfect, to hit this unattainable mark. And I'm sure that no parent had the same definition of what perfection was, but then to have this incapacitated God that you had to somehow heal and make happy, that's a lot for anybody, but especially for children. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So what was your childhood like? What, in your family unit,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, were you all, did you go out and have fun a lot? Did everything revolve around the church and church activities?
Yeah.
What was that for you?
So in church, we believed, I would like to use the past tense there. We believed that man was subject and woman was object. So that meant that the man is in the dominant position. So the man's mission, the father's, as the head of the household, his mission was the most important. And so my childhood really revolved around my father getting his degrees so that he could, work for the providence on a higher level. Because by the time the 90s rolled around, Moon's focus was really shifting towards influence, peddling influence in Washington, D.C., various think tanks and whatnot. Pre-interview, you and I were talking about how he started the Washington Times, and a lot of where we're at politically right now, I wonder how much can be traced back to a lot of Unification Church money going into right-wing politics. So my father's mission was to get his PhD in North Korea relations. And so my childhood was basically like, stay quiet so that dad can write his dissertation. And my mom tried to get us out of the house as much as possible because we weren't allowed to play with other kids. Although there was this mind fuck where she was like, why can't you guys make friends? Like, why do I always have to be the one to entertain you? But then if I try to play with other kids, she's like, your friends are so low standard, as this like reflection of I'm a bad person because I can't find friends that she feels are appropriate.
And is that because that would reflect negatively on her?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I hung out with the nerdy kids at school because, we were like part of the gifted program and stuff. But for some reason, I think she would have preferred if I had like super evangelical friends or like Mormon friends, kids that were sort of on a similar path.
Jehovah's Witness friends.
Right. If I had had a Jehovah's Witness friend, she probably would have been thrilled unless like somebody tried to indoctrinate me into their group. So there was like really no winning. Again, it was one of those sort of moving goalposts. And so we didn't have a lot of money. We barely made rent, not a lot of food for 5 kids. And so in order to entertain us, like I have this very strong memory of our mom taking us to like this clearing in the woods where there was like this, it was probably like a water treatment plant with like a dam. And so we called it the waterfall. There was all this water that would fall down, and we would like spend hours there, like skipping stones and stuff like that. And one time my dad came along with us, and he's like, this is not an appropriate place for children to be playing. There's like garbage everywhere and like broken glass. And I never noticed it until he mentioned it. And my mother was like, oh, it just figures the one time you bring dad to a slice of heaven, all he can do is bring the spiritual atmosphere down. And so I look at that as like, that was so much a worldview of my mother, of like having these blinders on and not seeing a lot of things and putting us into situations that maybe weren't appropriate. Like she would sneak us into hotels. She would sneak us into the pool, like places that she didn't have to pay. I remember one time she snuck us into the zoo. And when we were leaving, my little brother, who was like then in the car seat, starts going, "You're disgusting. Go back there and pay." Because like his sense of morality was so offended that she snuck us into the zoo without paying.
Wow. How old was he?
I don't know. He was, I mean, young enough to be in a car seat, under 5.
Crazy. That's very intense.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So how did she react? Did she let that go, or did she?
I think that she looked at it as like spirit world was speaking through my brother, and like, she used to take directions through him. Again, we're talking about a kid who would have been like 3 or 4 in a car seat, right? And if we were driving somewhere that she didn't know where it was, he'd be like, "Go that way." And she'd be like, "Oh, spirit world is directing him. Maybe I need to go that way." Oh. And eventually, enough times of us getting lost that way, I was like, "Mom, I need a map. I will be your navigator."
I have to ask, because you said man is subject, woman is object.
Yeah.
Were children treated differently too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because in the 4-position foundation, again, that sort of like pseudo-intellectual graph, if God is up here and man and woman are here, child was at the bottom, right? And so as a child, you were definitely at the bottom of like one of the 4-dimensional matrices hierarchy thing, you know?
Okay, but still the male child is to be listened to more than the female child.
Well, and so that's really interesting because my sister and I are the 2 eldest of 5. And we have 3 younger brothers, and we were basically raised to help raise them. Like we were, you know, we were like second mothers to them. We were like the maids. There was definitely like, you know, we cooked and cleaned. I learned how to do laundry when I was very young. My sister and I changed all their diapers. So we were caregivers, and they still, I mean, maybe now as adults, they have those skills, but it took them a really, really long time. Whereas my sister and I grew up very fast, and we were expected to be like those surrogate mothers.
Now, let's say that you and your sister weren't you and your sister, and you were 2 brothers who were the oldest. Would they be expected to take care of the younger children? Okay,
yeah,
so they would as well. So that was the hierarchy just based on age. I mean, that's kind of just a thing that happens in a lot of families.
It is, for sure. There was, I mean, it was definitely a gendered thing for sure, but men were definitely given more precedence in a lot of regards. But older brothers and older sisters, like we called everybody brother and sister or aunt and uncle. And I know that they do in a lot of other groups. But girls had to call older brothers oppa, which is older brother in Korean, and 언니 for older sister in Korean. And boys had to call older sisters nuna and older brothers hyung. And so you would be like, you know, Grace 언니. And so there was that sense of like, they have responsibility towards you, but they are also above you in the hierarchy as well.
You just said some of those things in Korean, and it made me think. So your father went to college for North Korean diplomacy or studies or
international relations with
international relations.
Yeah.
Okay. Moon was Korean.
Yes. Yeah.
North Korean?
He was born in North Korea. Yeah. Okay. But then he escaped into South Korea, and
okay.
I'm not the expert of that history. And honestly, a lot of it is mythology as well. But he was imprisoned in a labor camp in North Korea and then escaped, I believe, like right around the time of the Korean War.
Okay. I just wondered, because North Korea itself, politically is its own, it's on an island kind of, it's its own thing. And I just wondered if the church that you were part of had anything to do with North Korea, if there was a connection in some way.
It had its roots in North Korea.
Okay.
And so one of the reasons why Moon was sent to a labor camp was that he was, I mean, I guess they considered him like a disturber of the peace. But he was not in North Korea at the time of like the dictatorship of the Kim family or anything like that.
Okay.
But there is something to be said about like the ways in which the Unification Church functioned and how there are similarities to the indoctrination techniques of North Korea and their mind control methods, or their thought reform methods, excuse me. Dr. Margaret Singer and Robert J. Lifton have compared it to what was done to prisoners of war in North Korea, for example. And so, I mean, I still struggle to align the fact that, like, okay, prisoners of war experience similar things in many ways that I did in my childhood, but I do believe that a lot of those techniques are similar.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Not at all. The episode I just released was on Scientology, and L. Ron Hubbard apparently had some sort of an infatuation with China or something, and there were certain ways that things were done there that he liked, and he brought, used some certain terminologies and such. And so, I'm not surprised that one would see control exerted in one place and then, exert that control in their own lives in some way.
Right. And, as a different way of looking at this, a lot of the culture of the Unification Church is similar to Korean culture because Moon imported a lot of his beliefs and things from just the culture that he was raised in. And so, I don't know how similar it is to like the way that South Korea functions now, but there are things, just the patriarchy of the Unification Church could be said to be similar to the patriarchal societal structure of Korea at the time that Moon was growing up. And so there are a lot of things that we imported. But the language in general, we believed that Korea was the chosen nation and that Korean was the language of heaven.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, yeah.
Cool.
So we were supposed to learn Korean, which is why we called people Oni, Oppa. When I was growing up, we called Moon Abuji, which is father. In English, we called him true father. So,
okay.
There was a lot of that.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, okay, so you're growing up. Now you don't go to church a lot, right?
Right.
So most of the teaching that is being done to you is being done in the home.
Yeah, it was a daily basis kind of a thing. Every morning we had morning service. So we would wake up and have a service at 6 a.m. in our prayer room. Generally, you were supposed to have a separate room designated as a prayer room. And we did for many years growing up. But then as there were more kids, there was less space. So sometimes it would be like our living room also functioned as the prayer room. And so you'd have a small altar. Sometimes it was like a coffee table or a side table. We used an old desk at one time, and like our altar cloth was a white towel. That's how, well-to-do we were.
Do with what you got.
Yeah, I know. Roll with it. And so you would have pictures of Reverend and Mrs. Moon on your altar, and you would have holy candles. You would bow 3 times. You would say the pledge, and you would do readings of Moon's words. Now, so then it became what was called hunduke. Later, they just changed the word because, you had to morph all the time and keep people on their toes. Every Sunday, you would wake up and have 5 a.m. pledge. My family, I think, was maybe one of the more fundamentalist families in that if my dad was out of town for a conference or something, and my mom was making breakfast for us to go to school, my sister and I were running morning service in the prayer room. So like I'd have a baby in my arms and like she and I would be leading the holy songs and the prayers and, reading. And I remember talking to friends in the church and them being like, yeah, we don't do that. So I don't know if everybody did morning service every day, but my family was definitely hardcore about that.
I got to ask, because you said this several times, what is the pledge? Is this a pledge to Moon?
Yes.
Or,
okay. Yeah. So this is one of those things that evolved over the years too. But my pledge originally was 5 verses of language pledging yourself completely to God, but also sort of Reverend Moon. And so when I was 4 years old, I would be saying like, I pledge to run into the enemy camp and judge, the sinners with the weapons that God has been using against Satan. And I think the last verse was like, I basically pledge that I will sacrifice my life for God and for this providence. I pledge and swear. So we would say that every day. Most families said it every Sunday. And then I think it was in the mid 90s, I want to say 94, that my pledge evolved into something called the family pledge. And it was more about like, we will create the ideal blessed family and things like that. And it became a lot less militarized language. But we would say that pledge every morning in English and in Korean. So like, if you called me out on it, I could still probably recite some of the pledge in Korean because it was just drilled into my head over and over.
The whole militarized language running into the enemy camp and such. Mm-hmm. Did you all have, so like for Jehovah's Witnesses, we were taught that this thing would come called the Great Tribulation, and it would come before Armageddon. Mm-hmm. During the Great Tribulation, likely the government would turn against Jehovah's Witnesses, and we would be put in concentration camps. And so there was just like all of this language that was used and all this imagery that we weren't to fight necessarily, but we were to be willing to die mm-hmm. for our beliefs, even at the hand of the government or whoever. Yeah. Did that militarized language that you were using there, did it have an application at any point? Was there to be something that was going to come down at some point that you were going to have to fight for or act upon?
I think that depending on who you asked, the question would change. Moon had armaments factories. Like he produced guns and he sold weapons to other countries. And the way that he justified it was that, we may have to defend ourselves. Like we are going to be people of peace, but if it comes down to it, we will defend ourselves with force. I don't think that there was anything as structured as what you're talking about. And I didn't even really know about these weapons factories until I went on something called STF, which was basically like this institutionalized labor trafficking for young people, but we can get to that later. If you had asked me about some of the language, like in the pledge, when I was still in the church, I would have assumed that it was hyperbole. But later I learned that there was a complete expectation for you to die for Moon if you had to, because one of the girls that was on STF with me did die. She was murdered, and she was called this heavenly sacrifice for God. Like they didn't shut that program down. They continued it. A kid died in a car accident the next year because I guess their team captain was like driving for so many hours that he couldn't stay awake. So the one kid died. Another kid was in a coma for a while. 2 of my friends were in car accidents where luckily nobody was severely injured. But it really did come down to people were willing to die and sacrifice their children for Moon. So I do think, based on what I've seen come out of the church in the years that I've left, with the Sanctuary Church, which pre-interview you and I were talking about, the youngest son has split off from the main branch of the church. And he has talked about how like the AR-15 rifle is the rod of iron from Revelations, and that, there will come a time where we will have to defend ourselves. So he trains his congregation in the use of arms in, I believe, MMA. Like he posts videos of that. So I do think that there is a much more literal interpretation of some of that these days. But again, when I was growing up, I would have assumed it was hyperbole.
Oh, that's scary stuff. Mm-hmm. Ours never required it. It was unique. There was no action required on our part except for to just go along, go against the grain, not be a part of the world. Mm-hmm. Not when it came to when things would come down in the end, we weren't to fight. We were to just wait for Jehovah's armies to come from the heavens and, mm-hmm. Basically murder everyone else for our salvation. which, I mean, it's its own terrible thing.
Yeah.
But when you're creating armaments and things, that's it's next level, and that's scary.
Yeah. And again, I don't know how many people were fully aware of the armaments factories, for example, because I was doing research recently for a writing project, and the Unification Church does an excellent job of self-archiving. And there was one person's testimony who was like, yeah, no, the armaments factory existed. I worked there, but I was under NDA, kind of a thing. So I don't know if at some point that information was kind of buried. The first time I heard about it was when I was fundraising on this labor trafficking program. And this woman that was a potential customer goes, do you know Reverend Moon makes guns? Why would a man who says he's about peace need to have an armament factory? And I was like, I was completely flabbergasted. I didn't know what to say. I thought she was lying to me. And when I asked one of my teammates later that day, she gave me this very shifty answer of like, well, we may need to defend ourselves someday, and Father has a reason for doing everything that he does, which was basically the answer for everything, right? Is that like Father is justified in anything that he does. There's a providential reason for it. If he had an affair and a child out of wedlock, there's a providential reason. And don't you question the Messiah. Like, you don't know.
Yeah, just trust it. It's all good.
Right. And to have questioned something like really marks you as being a bad person.
Wow.
Yeah.
I understand that you weren't allowed to question the Jehovah's Witnesses either. That would be some indication of a spiritual problem.
Yes.
They would need to maybe readjust your thinking by basically, using the Bible or Watchtower publications to batter you until you just say, okay, you're right, and move on, So you mentioned earlier, you alluded to 14, you were this counselor and you were kind of living this different life.
Yeah.
So how did things go from being this young child, you're raising your brothers, you're doing the things you've got to do, but how do you get to the point, I guess maybe then you weren't raising them, maybe that was later, but how do you get to the point where at 14, you're a counselor and you're not exactly who you're supposed to be?
So until I was 12, we lived in Virginia and we were pretty much separate from anybody else in the church. But then when I turned 12, my mom decided that we were going to move back to Arizona, which is where she had joined the church. She was born in Mexico, but she kind of grew up in Arizona from the time she was 7. And so my father had finished his PhD and he had lost his church job. The church has a history of kind of using people and spitting them out. So suddenly our income was gone, and my grandparents had a travel agency. So my mother got a job with her parents and decided she was going to support us. And I think, but I cannot confirm, but I think that my mother was probably trying to get out of the marriage. But, she was so indoctrinated that she kind of dug her heels in. So we moved to Phoenix. And this is the first time that I was really in a church environment that I was seeing blessed children on a pretty regular basis. We moved in the summertime. So this is before I started going to 8th grade. So we had a lot of opportunity to interact with other kids. And the state leader at the time was also the head of the church youth group. And it was a smaller community. There's not a lot of members in Arizona, but there were a couple of kids my age and my sister's age. And this youth group, their activities were, again, like basically labor trafficking kind of activities. So the state leader also happened to be a state assemblyman in the government. And like my first week there, he sends me, my sister, and his 2 oldest children out into the heat of the desert, into these neighborhoods to canvass the neighborhood for his reelection. We were not supervised at all. We were out there for hours. And I'm a kid coming from like the lush Virginia landscape into the desert. I do not know how to like handle 110-degree weather, dryness. So I got heat stroke that first week. I remember sitting down, like feeling like I was going to vomit. And my sister being like, oh my God, are you okay? And these other 2 kids coming up to me being like, did you finish this block yet? And my sister's like, no, Jen's not feeling good. And they were like, you're just caning out. And so caning out was this term that we would use to shame people back into correct behavior. And it refers to Cain, who killed Abel. And so basically it means being negative. So if you're negative, you're caning out and you're creating that foundation for Satan to invade. And, I don't know, maybe you'll become like this murderous wretch or something. But so it was the first experience of mine where I'd ever even heard that term, and my first experience, like really understanding what Moon meant. So he preached about mind-body unity, and you had to overcome your body and really align with your mind. And he'd say, like, you have to like basically beat your body into submission, go as far as killing your body in order to, have mind-body unity. So that meant depriving yourself of sleep, of food, of water, whatever, sex, obviously. And so it was my first experience of really understanding the depth of what that meant. I had heard it at workshops and things. And again, I didn't have the language to say this, but I probably thought it was a hyperbole. Like, oh, you just got to work really hard and like, I don't know, meditate on it or something. No, you actually have to like completely ignore your body. And so a lot of my experiences with this youth group were labor trafficking. For July 4th, we had to go out into a city park and sell light ropes. So I'm walking around with product, no adult supervision, selling things at 12 years old. And I had like men coming on to me and things like that. Now, luckily, there was no physical contact or anything like that, but it was an unsafe environment. Another activity was we had to scrub the state leader's kitchen floor with toothbrushes because he wanted the grout cleaned. And that was supposed to like help us understand God's heart better. And one time I was a little bit older, and Moon wanted us to bless people. So ideally he wanted people coming to these mass blessings, but that wasn't really feasible because like nobody cared about the Unification Church anymore. They knew too much about it. They didn't want to join. And so leaders approved something called holy candy, where you would distribute holy wine, which is supposed to be part of the ceremony to cut off the lineage of Satan. So some people were spiking reservoirs with holy wine and being like, all these people that are connected to this reservoir are blessed. But holy candy was where you would spike candy with holy wine. So I showed up one time to do, I don't know, some sort of activity at the state leader's house, and everybody is sitting around the kitchen table and there's piles of Tootsie Rolls. And my sister and I watch them as they are unwrapping Tootsie Rolls, taking needles, dipping them into wine, piercing the Tootsie Rolls, and then closing them back up and then putting them into a pile. And we were brought to the Grand Canyon then to hand them out. But when I was like, this is weird and this is creepy, I was again told like, you're caning out, you're multiplying doubt was another term that we used. And so it was basically sit down and shut up. And so in my mind, I was questioning a lot. I was like, this seems weird. This seems creepy. I was allowed to go trick-or-treating for Halloween. And one of the things that our mom made us do was check all of our candy. So I'm sitting here going, why are we doing the very thing that my mom didn't want other people to do to our candy? So I had all of these questions forming as I was integrating into this church community. And by the time I was in high school, I was basically living this double life. I had friends for the first time because my mom actually ended up becoming state leader by the time I was 14. So she was really never home. My dad had a job, so he wasn't really home. So my sister and I were, you're like, pause, time out.
Wait. So a woman can be state leader?
Yeah, a woman could be state leader probably in a small community. I don't think that a woman would have been state or regional leader for like anything larger.
Oh, wait. When you say state leader, you don't mean like you were in Arizona. Do you mean the state of Arizona?
Yeah, because there were so few members. She was like the church leader there. But it was also this job that was passed around like a hot potato in Arizona because like everybody hated the state leader. They became like this lightning rod for ire. And my mom was like, again, super fundamentalist. So if the members wanted to like come to the center, which we called our churches centers, if they wanted to come to the center, which was basically just a house that the church owned, and practice something like Reiki or meditation, she locked people out because she's like, I don't approve of messing with spirit world that way. Like she was hardline. So other people were maybe a little more liberal. Okay. But I don't think that if we had lived in like Washington, D.C. or something, she would have become a state leader. Now, as a side note, Reverend Moon's daughter was the leader of the church for a very short time. His wife is now leading the main branch of the church. So there are some exceptions to the sexism but not many.
Okay. I was just really surprised when you said that. Your mom was the leader. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's just because nobody else wanted to do it.
Okay.
I think that if a man had stepped into the breach, she wouldn't have been considered, but it was kind of like, Kim, you want to do this? So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you carry on. So you were saying.
Yeah, so she was state leader. So she was witnessing a lot in the center. And that left me to kind of like run around the neighborhood a little more freely. So I finally made friends. I had a boyfriend, which was super not okay. If anybody found out that I had a boyfriend, I would have been shunned. I would have been completely shunned. Not that we had a formal shunning process like disfellowship, but we definitely had like, nobody would talk to you. Nobody would look at you. You would have been like subjected to way more abuse.
Would there be a way to come back in their good graces?
It depends.
Oh,
it's complicated because
there's no formal process for being shunned. So there's probably no formal process for being unshunned.
As of, I think 2006, if you paid enough money to go to a forgiveness ceremony, you could technically be sort of like, I don't know if your status as second generation would be restored or you'd be like tainted status. I don't know. You could stay in the church, but you would be like doing penance forever because they believed that the fall was the worst sin that you could commit. So it was worse than murder. You would be lower than Hitler, kind of a thing. So, I mean, I guess you could like prostrate yourself enough that you would be happy being like the lowest of the low, and you would have to marry a first generation or another fallen second generation. But there was no like grace. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
you were taking a big chance.
I know.
Having a boyfriend. My goodness.
Yeah, I was kind of, if you think about it, and I didn't think about it to that degree, I think I just compartmentalized my life so much that I didn't really consider the implications. Because I did meet a girl who had been shunned. Her parents brought her to church and she was an untouchable. Like you couldn't speak to her. It was just, I mean, it was horrible. And that terrified me. But at the same time, because I had grown up with the secret identity so much, I had to compartmentalize my life so much that I don't think that the two parts of my brain were really communicating enough. But eventually I was like, I think I have to leave the church because like, how do I reconcile this? You know? And I knew that nobody could find out because then my purity would come into question. Now, like really, this relationship was so PG. Like we'd hold hands in the hallway.
Yeah, you're just kids.
I know. It was like really kind of cute when you think about it. But because I had kissed a boy, you know, and we were so into purity culture too, I was tainted. You know, I had given away a part of my purity. Who would want me now? And so I don't think that my mom knew that I had a boyfriend, but I had snuck to go to a dance with him. And then I had felt so much guilt afterwards that I did confess that I had snuck out to this dance because those were completely off limits. And so I think that my mom, without knowing that I had a boyfriend, I think that she knew that I was in danger. And so that's when she sent me to this series of indoctrination activities, including that workshop that I mentioned. So I think I was gone for an entire summer of just being indoctrinated at various workshops. There was this tour called the Pure Love Alliance. And we were like doing these marches and rallies for abstinence. And the church had created this organization supposedly as a non-sectarian nonprofit, but it was all church members on the board. And their goal was to get their abstinence only curriculum into schools. And they did get it into like, I think 60 Chicago schools before they realized there was a connection to the Unification Church. So here I am like preaching about abstinence. I'm giving speeches about abstinence. And meanwhile, I have a boyfriend back home and I am like struggling to reconcile these things. And that becomes kind of the trajectory of the years that come, where I think intellectually, I felt like I wasn't the person that I was presenting to the church, but I was fighting the indoctrination so much, and it would subsume me at times.
Even at 14, when you were that counselor, And you kind of knew, was that one of those periods then where you were kind of torn, where you realized that you've got this double life? And again, as I like to point out to people, and I don't know how this was presented in your group, but with Jehovah's Witnesses, they always present the double life, outside life, as the secondary one that's not the real you. The real you is the Jehovah's Witness version. When reality, the real you is the one that's wanting to go out and have this other free life,
right?
But you keep getting, drawn back into the Jehovah's Witness life. Is that kind of how it was talked about with you all?
I don't know that there was formal language around it. My mother would caution me about living a double life. And I think that I might have even had the intellectual wherewithal to be like, how does one expect me to not live a double life? I think that we were supposed to be living witnesses. And I don't know that everybody was given the same directive that I was, to have this secret identity. Like kids who grew up in like the Tarrytown, New York area near one of the Moon compounds, I think they were on the spectrum between not wanting outside people to know that they were Unification Church members because they would get bullied and beaten up, versus like some of them would have divine principle books on their desk and would like witness to their friends. So I think it really depended on how you were raised.
Okay, so I didn't know that you said the Moon compounds. So then,
there were many.
Okay, so then there were more isolationist, restrictive compounds, and then also the more, I don't know, the other people who lived on the outside and still practiced.
So I think it evolved over time. When my parents joined, they would have lived in a center. So they would have lived communally. They would have shared their clothes communally. They would have fundraised all day for the commune. And so there were centers in every major city all over the country. And a lot of that property is still owned by the church. When I was born, I believe that my parents had just moved out of like a communal space, but my parents lived in the New Yorker Hotel for many years before I was born. So the church bought the hotel, I think in like 1972, and people lived in it. And there was also like church headquarters there. When I refer to Moon's compound, he has, there again, many properties all over the world, many mansions, now palaces even, like there's a palace in Korea. I think there might be two. But in Tarrytown, New York specifically, there are two major properties that the church owns. There's Belvedere in Tarrytown, and then like right up the road, technically in Irvington, I think, is East Garden. So one is like an 18-acre compound, and then there's another one that's like, I think there might be like 25 acres at Belvedere. And only like high-ranking, like the Moon family lived in East Garden. They used to live in Belvedere before they bought East Garden. I don't know how many members actually lived in these compounds, but they were like, Belvedere became more of a training center for people. So you might live there while you were going through like a 21-day indoctrination workshop or something. But then in, I believe, the 80s, again, because the church was on the decline in terms of new membership, people were sent out of the centers to do something called home church and tribal messiahship. So you would go to the husband's hometown and you would basically start witnessing to people. So people started living in more like nuclear families. And then I think that Moon realized that like, oh shit, I'm losing power here. So he tried to mobilize people again, because once they were out of these communal living spaces, people focused more on their families. And I think a lot of people did leave at that point. So there was, various efforts to reel people back in. But the point being that by the time I grew up, I was not I lived in the church center in Tempe when I was a baby, but I didn't live in a church center for the most part. But there are other kids that did grow up in these much more isolated situations. The thing about when I say like Irvington and Tarrytown, which are these adjacent places in Westchester, that was just such a concentration of church members there that kids could kind of grow up in the church bubble without a whole lot of interaction with the outside world.
I guess when you say compound, I'm automatically thinking, walls.
No, not like that. And there are groups that are like that. There is security. There are iron gates at East Garden. So there was a time where like I was trapped within those gates and could not get out. And we could talk about that. And at Belvedere too, I believe that it's fenced off and there's security at the front and things like that. So, I mean, essentially it is a compound. But in terms of like people living their daily life in that space, there would be fewer people percentage wise as opposed to the greater population of the church.
Okay. So most of you were out. So how did it impact you when you were sent off to do this indoctrination? Did you come back and get rid of your boyfriend, or like what?
I wrote in my journal that even PLA didn't make me strong enough to end this. Like, so, I was definitely fighting the feeling of guilt. What I did do is I went to my mom after I came home from, months long indoctrination. And I said to my mother, Mom, if I stay at this school, I'm afraid I'm going to fall. But I didn't admit to her about the boyfriend or anything like that. So she unenrolled us all from school. She uprooted us and she moved us across the city and enrolled us in like a Mormon district so that we would be away from that kind of influence. And then my boyfriend broke up with me because he's like, I just want to have fun my senior year, because he was a little older than me. So yeah, I was not the one that ended it, but I was the catalyst for it ending based on my guilt.
Sure. So then you all were moved in with the Mormons. That's interesting.
Yeah, that was a really rough time. So Mesa, Arizona, I think is like the second dense in terms of population density, like the second largest Mormon area in the United States behind Salt Lake City. So the first question that I was asked at school by almost everybody is, are you LDS? And at first I didn't know what that meant. And so they're like, obviously not. But then once I answered no, it was like, they wanted nothing to do with me. So I was sort of back to this super isolationist experience.
Did you go to school? Were there any other kids there from the Unification Church, or was it just you and
just
maybe you had a sibling that made it at the same time?
My sister was in middle school at the time, I think. So no, it was just me. I was the only Mooney kid.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a shared experience. Many Jehovah's Witnesses who are the only ones in their school, but they aren't often in a school full of other people who are all a part of another group.
Yeah.
That is necessarily going to treat them differently.
Yeah.
So that's got to be really tough. How did it feel to be such a minority? Did that in any way? Did you have we had a persecution complex? We were told, okay, so you all had that. Then, so did that play into that?
I mean, we were taught that like persecution is part of how you paid indemnity. And indemnity is this word to like sort of refer to like paying back or like paying it forward to like heal sins and stuff. I'm not being very articulate about it, but anytime you were persecuted, we were taught that, you're getting closer to God's heart, you're getting closer to true Father's heart. And so in a sense, like if you were being persecuted, it meant that you were on the right path,
Yeah, same here. Persecution was just proof that you were doing the right thing. So, so I guess that actually then played into some of the narrative that you had been given through your church.
Yeah.
Did going to this new school strengthen your resolve then?
No,
inside the church?
So one of my issues growing up was that I didn't function really well in this isolationist kind of structure. And so from the time that I was in 7th grade, I started dropping out of school like second semester, begging my mother to homeschool me. Now, I did it 7th grade, I did it 8th grade, and then I did it 10th grade, so which was when I was in this Mormon school. There was never any homeschool curriculum that manifested. I was basically left alone to like encyclopedias, but it was so hard for me to function with kids that wouldn't even acknowledge me that I completely crumbled. And additionally, my family really started to crumble around that time too. My father was very abusive growing up, and my mother had her own sort of mental and emotional abuse, and their marriage was really disintegrating. And so around this time, my mother accused my father of having sexually abused all of us kids when we were babies. Now, none of us remembered it. but she believed this with enough of herself that eventually she left my father for a period of time. And so that, on top of going to a school where even the teachers were Mormon and wanted nothing to do with me, I just couldn't function anymore. And so I dropped out, and I was like, I'd stare at encyclopedias all day being like, yep, this is my education.
So you dropped out to encyclopedias. So how did it, your mom left. Did she leave you with your dad?
No. So what happened was, one day my dad was going to Korea to present a paper, and she slipped a note into his briefcase, basically detailing all of her accusations and saying, stay in Korea, don't come back. And then she had us go to these grocery stores and get their leftover cardboard. We packed everything in boxes and put it all into storage. And then she escaped with us.
Okay.
For several weeks. I think we were living on my grandfather's credit card. We were basically living in motels for a time. And my dad refused to stay away. But I think we maxed my grandfather's credit cards out because she just brought us back to the house one day when my dad was there. And so we had to live in this house with my father that my mother has convinced us is a monster. And to be clear, she had been seeding these suspicions for years. I remember one of the first times she talked about it, I must have been 8 years old. And she said to me something along the lines of Jenny, have you ever touched your brother's holy places inappropriately? And I was like, I change their diapers all the time. Maybe accidentally. And so, she had been weaving suspicions for many years. So by the time I was 15 and she was outright accusing him, I had been groomed to believe that this was possibly true. So we were basically living in this house with a man that she had convinced us was a monster. And then the summer rolls around and she sent me out again on one of these indoctrination tours with the Pure Love Alliance. And I was giving speeches about purity and abstinence, with a bunch of kids who believed that the fall of man was a sexual sin. And I might have been unpure because my mother told me that sexual abuse of children is the only sin that God cannot forgive. Even the fall, God can forgive, but this he can't. And so I was sent back out into my world believing that I was now tainted and that I had to hide this.
Did you feel, okay, so she's saying that not just the abuser is...
Yeah, we were tainted by being the victim of abuse.
But could you be forgiven?
No.
You couldn't be forgiven either for being a baby and being the victim of abuse.
According to her, there was no way for God to forgive this. God didn't know how to forgive it. And again, there was no...
So terrible.
It's batshit crazy.
So then if you know something like that, what makes you not just say, well, for lack of a better term, fuck it then. What am I doing? Why do I care about any of this stuff? I'm going to go live my life,
because I think if I had been 20 years old, I probably would have been. But I was 15. I was completely dependent on my parents, and I had grown up in a closed system. And so the way that translated for me was that I have to hide this now. I have to create another layer of secret identity, because if anybody finds this out, that I'm tainted like this, I will never find a marriage partner. I will be completely shunned. Whatever I had done holding hands with my boyfriend, that was nothing now compared to this.
So is this, then I'm trying to think in my head as we're talking. So, this is kind of comparative to, I don't know if I want to, it's there's something wrong with you. I'm not saying there's anything actually wrong.
No, I believed that with my whole heart when I was that age, though.
Okay. I've interviewed a lot of people who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were gay, and they knew they were gay, and they knew that they had this thing that God knew that they had, and that it was this, and it wasn't okay.
Yeah.
But they were still trying, or sometimes even doubling down, trying to somehow earn that love and respect.
And I think
So,
that that is a perfect way of describing what happened with me.
okay.
Like I gave speeches, I like tried to be the most perfect person that I could be because I didn't know if there was a way to like earn God's forgiveness or anything like that. But as far as I knew, I was consigned to hell. But by virtue of something I didn't even remember, I didn't even know if it was true. And since then, my sister and I've talked about it a lot. We think that our mother may have been abused as a child and it was, a projection. I've talked to
Sure.
mental health practitioners, and they're like, your mother sounds like she might have had borderline personality disorder. So it could have been untrue completely, but I
Yeah.
really, really took it in as something is inherently wrong with me. And like this is not even like examining queer identity at all. I just thought
Yeah.
there was something fundamentally wrong with me. And later I realized I had attractions to both sexes, but back then it was like, I'm fucked. So I better
Yeah.
work really, really hard so nobody finds out.
And it's because of abuse too. That's just so messed up.
Mm-hmm.
It it would not be a surprise to me if your mother was projecting.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I mean, man, that's just kind of a if you're worried about your kids and how they act, um, could you make something up like that if you're worried about your kids going on the wrong path
Mm.
to make them go, really double down and get into this really, really hard,
Yeah.
maybe not even knowing that you're doing it. It's just
I mean, that's a,
feeling a loss of control and manipulating the
yeah.
only way that you feel like you can regain control because you're desperate.
I mean, I've never thought of it in that regard. The way that I've explained it to myself, and you make an excellent point, but the way that I've explained it to myself is that my mother, again, because of purity culture and then whatever other issues she brought to the table from her life, I think that she looked at the normal sexual development as children as being problematic.
Oh,
So, when my little brothers are starting to discover their penises, I think she looked at that as a sign of abuse, and not that like little children are very curious about their genitalia and each other's and things like that. And so she would point to those things as signs of abuse to me. And I obviously didn't have an education to be like, actually, you're wrong. I was
right.
just like, oh God, okay. Oh shit.
Yeah. And can we add that you're in an entire church that is sex centered?
Oh
There's
yeah.
everything here is purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's sex or it's not sex or
Yeah.
whatever. And so when that's the focus,
Mm-hmm.
it would not be shocking to see someone, if they think something's wrong, it's probably going to be along those lines because
Right.
that's what the focus is so much.
Yeah, and that's something that I've since learned, obviously, from coming out and then doing research, is that a purity culture movement is a hyper sex focused movement, and I grew up believing that it was totally non-sexual because I had to suppress my sexuality and everything around it so much. But since then, you're right; it is such a focus on sex that it would make sense in a very dysfunctional way that anything like that would become sex centered. And I mean, I just sent a bunch of Reverend Moon quotes to somebody else who's doing a podcast on the second generation Mooney experience. And these Reverend Moon quotes and most of his speeches are so sex focused and so like penis, vagina focused. Like some of it is very violent too. Like he talked about like women who don't feel like they need men, you should cement your vagina shut. And then the head of the man's penis is like a poisonous snake. Like those kinds of things were very, very common for us to be reading in the morning. Like this is like the
As
training that we're getting
kids,
as kids. Yes. Yeah. I
oh
mean, he said
wow,
that when I was 12, he said that American women are descended from a line of prostitutes, and that like women are like trash cans. So again, a lot of the theology, not only was it sex based, but the words that we were reading as like the words of the Messiah were incredibly misogynistic, but just like sexually violent too. He said that men should keep pliers in their pockets and pinch their penises every day to like suppress their sexual desire, or you should cut off the head of your penis because that's how much you had to suppress your sexual desire. Meanwhile, supposedly the church comes from like a culture of basically orgies, and he was having sex with women and he was having illegitimate children, but he's telling everybody else, create such a dysfunctional relationship with your own sexuality that this kind of abuse thinking could manifest. Yeah.
Thou doth protest too much.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
That guy's all about purity, and we know what the reality was,
yes.
right? The Jehovah's Witnesses have quite the purity culture too. Not anything like that. That's beyond. But it was just, a revelation to live in an organization that constantly talked about sex in a negative light and made it sound like if you left the cult of Jehovah's Witnesses, that everyone on the outside was just basically having orgies all the time, and it was just this free-for-all crazy thing. And then you get out and you just realize that that's just not who people are. And
where's my orgy?
Yeah, where's the orgies? I thought there were going to be orgies.
Right.
It's just this crazy. You just see that they're really the ones that are obsessed with it. They are the ones that are afraid of it, that feel like it's this sin and you've got to watch yourself and all that. And so what they do is they create this whole culture around it that then has you, it unfortunately causes a lot of repression. And then people sometimes become sexless, or they become hypersexual because they've been put in this unreasonable environment. And it's just, they take one of the most normal things in life and make it very, very stressful and strange. And, they really damage a lot of people. And I imagine the same would be true with a group that is doing those kind of things, because it's just, they've taken something normal and tried to make it abnormal as possible.
And I think that a lot of high control groups do that with anything that you would consider to be like the most basic on the pyramid of needs, food, sleep, sex, those kinds of things. All of them were controlled. All of them were considered to be evil. And so, I think that people developed a lot of dysfunction around those things, but that is the best way to control people.
Yeah, it's almost the ultimate gaslighting. Take something that is so central to you and make you question your own desires, so that therefore you have to look to them to feel okay.
Yep, absolutely. I feel like it comes straight out of the playbook that all of these high control groups use.
Yeah, wow, that's just so terrible. So you're told this about your father, and you all have left and then come back. What was it like to come back into that situation with your father when you've been taught to see him as such a monster?
Well, it was terrifying. And, the moment that we entered the house again, my parents started screaming at each other. And my sister and I were used to getting our brothers out of the house. Like we would basically that day, as many days before, we opened the window, unfastened it. I climbed out the window, and then my sister handed each of my brothers to me, and we ran across the street to this convenience store nearby. And my sister and I happened to have enough money that we had scrounged up to, buy them a Coke and a candy or something to calm them down. And at some point, I said to my sister, I need to go back, because I was afraid that my father would hit my mother. He didn't often do it. He had done it a few times. He usually hit us. He was very physically abusive with us, usually with a belt. But at some point, I think when I was 12, I started standing up to him to protect my brothers. And my little sister was also, very much about protecting our brothers. And we were like, you're not allowed to hit them. We would blockade the door, kind of a thing. And so we sort of transferred that protectiveness to our mother, because it was such a new thing when he hit her that I think it scared us. And so my sister was like, you're not going back alone. I'm coming with you. And so we brought our brothers back across the highway and back into the house. And we sort of sat hunkered in the bedroom, where there was just mattresses in there at the time, listening to the fighting, kind of waiting to see if we had to intervene. And luckily we didn't. But shortly thereafter, my mother sent me on the 2000 PLA tour, Pure Love Alliance tour. And so I was away for a month while my siblings were, I don't know where. As my mother was driving me to the airport to fly from Phoenix to Washington, D.C., she says to me, I want you to write down Grandma and Grandpa's number, because I don't know where you're going to be coming back to. She had gotten me a one-way ticket. And I was like, what? Like, I'm not coming home. And she's like, you can't expect me to know everything. She's like, I'm praying to spirit world for guidance, but I don't know what the next step is yet. So all I knew is that she was potentially leaving my father again. And so it was very weird because we were also taught to believe that anybody that was not part of the church family was part of the outside world. And so I did not have a strong relationship with my grandparents or my mother's brother, my uncle. So we weren't allowed to tell them what was going on, even though at one point, like, they had employed my mother in their business. And sometimes they'd ask me questions like, are you okay? You know, trying to see, because I was like just shutting down at some point. So it was such this weird experience for me that my mom is like, write down their number. You're going to have to call them to find out like where you're flying home to, because I don't know where we're going to be. And so she's telling me you're going to have to trust these outsiders to find out where home is.
Wow.
And so, yeah. So the first 2 weeks of this tour, I was originally part of the PR team, and I was having these like emotional breakdowns, panic attacks because of like my family is falling apart. I don't know where home is, and I might be potentially tainted. And I'm here like giving speeches about abstinence, and I'm a complete fraud. So they pulled me off of the PR team. I had failed my mission because I was just crying so much all the time. And after 2 weeks of this, we were in the Unification Theological Seminary at Barrytown. We were staying over in the dorms for a few days of workshop before we flew out to London, because we were going to conduct the second half of this tour in England, France, and Germany. And so one of the tour leaders comes to me and goes, Jenny, I need you to call home because we need to find out where you're flying back into once you fly, you know, like once the tour is done. And so this was the first time that I called my grandfather, and I was like, hey, Grandpa, it's Jenny. Do you know where my family is? And I found out that my parents had actually stayed in that house for 2 weeks while I was gone. So my sister was sort of the one that was trying to like mentally keep everything together and protect my brothers, protect my mother. And my mother, so I called home because I, you know, found out that my parents were still there. And I said, you know, so where am I flying into? And my mom says, I've gotten a job as a dorm mom at New Eden Academy, which is a boarding school for church members in Connecticut. And your father is going, we're going to tell everybody that your father has a mission in DC. And so for the next 9 months, they pretended that they had these separate missions, which was not uncommon. You know, again, Moon would separate families all the time. It was part of how you separate, you know, you break down that nuclear family bond. And so we had to pretend that nothing was wrong. All the while, you know, there's all these concerns of like, who am I in this church? What is my life going to be like? And this is right around the time that Moon decided that he was not going to bless the second generation or match the second generation anymore. It was going to be up to the parents. And so suddenly I'm like, okay, nobody's going to want me. Like, even if Moon had matched me, if somebody found out about my past, they would have had grounds to reject me. But, you know, Moon matching you has a certain cachet to it, but your parents matching you, it doesn't have that weight to it. So I was like, nobody's going to want me. And I was like, I'm fucked. But I also had a crush on another second generation, which again, not allowed. But I had started sharing my story with him, and we developed this emotional relationship and this emotional bond. And so I was like, this is my person. You know, this is the only person in the world that will accept me. He told me that he had actually gone through similar abuse. It wasn't his father that had abused him. So I never really thought of it and articulated it that way. But here's somebody who, as a victim of sexual abuse, was sort of at my same level. Yeah. I guess like on some sort of undercurrent level, I was like, oh, okay, so we're of the same caste or whatever. More what I was thinking is like, this is somebody who understands me and accepts me.
Of course.
So we weren't technically allowed to like suggest somebody, but I started trying to like move my mother in the direction of like, hey, there's this guy, you should talk to his mom, because like, you know, you two have been through similar things. His father was unfortunately very abusive too. And so I was like, our families could support each other and things like that. But eventually my mom found out that we had feelings for each other, and she was so abusive to him and so abusive to me. And then he ended up leaving the church around 18. But this was prior to that. We had actually like officially asked our parents to like, please let us be together. And they're like, no, even though some kids were doing it, some kids would be like, hey mom, I got a crush on so-and-so. And then their parents would be like, I just had the most spiritual dream, and they'd find like these convenient ways to be like, we've been inspired by heavenly spirit world that so-and-so and so-and-so should be together.
So why didn't your mom?
Why didn't she? I don't know. I think that she thought it was part of my fallen nature. She thought that I had what are called chapter 2 problems. And so in the unification theology and divine principle, chapter 2 was the chapter where they cover the fall of man. And so having a crush on somebody was considered a chapter 2 problem. Having sexual issues was considered a chapter 2 problem. And so I think that my mother just looked at it as like, I was a bad person. Because the way that she spoke to me, she'd call me a fallen Eve, a whore, a gutter snipe. Like she had very colorful language to try to abuse me back into line.
Now, had she always kind of called you those things, or was that just at this point in time?
The first time she called me something like that, I was 12. Yeah. So.
It does show a certain penchant for being obsessed with.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Actually, I think even younger, maybe when I was 10, she told me I was getting too pretty and that she needed to dye my hair purple and black my teeth out. So, part of purity culture is like women are stumbling blocks, right, for men. And we didn't have that language, but certainly as a woman, if men were attracted to me, I had done something to make myself attractive to them. And so at 10, you're prepubescent, you're not a sexual being at that time, but my mother was definitely looking at me in that way.
It could have just been simple jealousy that you found somebody that you liked, at that point or something, where she had lived such a miserable marriage, and was just so unhappy and things were falling apart. And then here you clearly have found somebody that you vibe with, and she wants to shut that down.
I mean, this may sound like I'm trying to defend her. One of the reasons that she gave me was like, he comes from a dysfunctional family, and so do you. And a young man who has not known proper male love cannot be a conduit of God's love to you. And so I think that she was hoping that I think she was hoping that I would marry a leader, because when I was 10, my dad's boss saw me at, some sort of church function. And he's like, oh, I want you to marry my son. Not that we could have, Moon was making those matches. We would have had no say in it. But I think that from that point, my mom wanted me to marry well, if you will, in the church.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And because his family had similar struggles, there were probably, scarlet A's, if you will, on his family from some perspective. And I think that she thought that children perpetuate the sins of the fathers, right? So because he came from a dysfunctional family, she was like, he's going to abuse you, basically. Like, I don't think she ever said it in those words, but I think that was the undercurrent of what she was saying. So there may have been part of her that really wanted the best for me, but there was a lot of other baggage that came with it too, for sure.
Yeah. Wow.
If at any point you need to like time out and just
no, it's just sad. It's sad. It's a point in life where you're supposed to be finding someone to marry, and you're holding this deep dark. I mean, talk about what was it? A secret identity. That you have a secret identity on another level, and and it's just that's just a lot to hold at that time, to have found someone that you really kind of feel like a good match with, or feel safe with, if nothing else. And then to have that not go well must have been kind of terrifying, because you don't know where you're going after
Mm-hmm.
that.
It was hard on both of us. I think that it really hurt him emotionally too, because he was being accused of being a potential abuser, essentially, and not good enough for me.
Yeah.
And so I remember him telling me, like, your mom is really hurting me. And I was like, I know, I'm sorry. You know, there was nothing I could do about it. But I do think that even kids who grew up in what you might say more normal homes in the Unification Church, there's still that tragedy of that normal sexual development being demonized. You know, your teens are supposed to be a time where you're exploring these things, and your first crush should be a beautiful thing. Your first relationship, you know, if you're lucky, should be like the first love. We romanticize it so much. And for all of these kids, we were taught that we were bad for having these feelings. So there was so much self-abuse going on too, that to me, like, that's the real tragedy, is that we learn to abuse and brainwash ourselves. And, you know, the things that we were experiencing and feeling were so normal, you know, and that our guts were probably right about so many things. And instead we learned to not trust ourselves.
Yeah, we internalized the message that we were
Mm-hmm.
somehow fallen or weak or
Yes.
sinful or whatever. I mean, we had it from the Bible, you had it from a different source, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the same. It's interesting even that you didn't have the Bible, but yet some of the messages you were getting were very similar to the same types of
Yeah.
messages that we were getting, just from a different source.
I mean, so Moon used the Bible as somewhat of a framework. Like, the Unification Church theology is a little bit of a hodgepodge of like New Agey religions and other religions. And so there are biblical quotes taken out of context and often misinterpreted to support Moon's theology and that he is the second coming and whatnot. And so I was not encouraged to read the Bible, but I was sort of like, taught to believe that the Bible was like the non-canonical prequel kind of a thing, you know?
The prequel to his book.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, but it is interesting, I think, and I think it really just goes to show that it's just it's a very human thing, and it's the way you control people is the same. I recently, and I'd love to give credit to whoever said this because I can't remember, but someone I talked to said that it was like cult Mad Libs. It's the same
Yes.
basic mechanism. We just
Yeah.
change the nouns, the adjectives, the verbs. You know, it's just different terms are thrown in there, but it's the same basic structure.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's the same way to control people, whether it's, you know, political cults like we see today,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, it's any kind of high control group
Right.
that can come about. You start to see the same types of control that are used.
Right. And when I had originally reached out to you, one of the things that I said is that I went to a recovery workshop a few years ago for kids who had been born and raised in high control groups. And one of the things that we discovered is we sort of all speak a dialect of the same root language. Like, you might have a different word for it, but we all experienced a lot of the same things.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
it's very true. So okay, so where do you go from here? So you're now you can't have the relationship that you were.
Right. So, part of this relationship is going on while I'm at this boarding school, and this boarding school was a really dysfunctional environment. Non-accredited teachers, not a lot of supervision, a lot of bullying. Some people have likened it to like Lord of the Flies. You know,
Mhm.
there were various boarding schools like this around the country and also in Korea. So I just happened to go to one of them. And, you know, because my mother was on staff, I was bullied a lot because, you know, people hated the staff, or the kids hated the staff. And so for me, that like really kind of added this other layer of otherness for me in the church. And what it did is it really strengthened my relationship with this other person that I had this crush on. And I really believe that it was, you know, this was my only chance. So, from the time that I was like 15 until the time that I was 18, I was fighting for that end in the church. And it got to a point where I think my mother was so abusive and so resolute in her no, that the relationship just broke down with this guy. And he ended up sleeping with this other girl and getting her pregnant and taking her for an abortion. And I found out after the fact. I didn't even really realize we were broken up, but that's how much our relationship had disintegrated, and how much I didn't understand relationships either.
Sure.
And our relationship, I think, had gotten to a point where we were probably very verbally, emotionally, mentally abusive to each other, because we're trying to be together and we can't, and we're angry and we're fighting all of the indoctrination. And so I think at some point he's like, I'm out. He's like, I just want to be with somebody who's like not batshit crazy, because I think that that's probably what it was like for him in the relationship. Certainly it was like that for me. Like he said incredibly hurtful things to me. I probably said a lot of hurtful things to him. I don't remember all of them.
Where were our healthy models, though?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And again, unfortunately, to underscore my mother's point, we had both grown up in dysfunctional families with highly abusive parents who were abusive to each other, abusive to us. And so again, yes, those were our models. I know that I modeled my mother in terms of my behavior with him. Like, she would try to pick fights. I could see her poking my dad, like, the sleeping badger, waiting for him to explode so that she could scream at him. And I know that I did that to this kid. And that was something that I had to work out as I left the church too, and understand like healthy communication models and how to ask for what I needed and feel my feelings. But so after he fell, and that was the word that I used. Like, to me, I don't consider it that now, but then, he had fallen. To me, it was like he had died. I could not be with this person. That was my one hope, my one chance. And now he was cut off from the church. And I think that he may have tried to reintegrate into the church, but I think that he was somewhat shunned after that point because he was untouchable, So I don't think that he ever. A lot of us maintain friendships when we're on the outside, and they can be tenuous, and we welcome people when they come out. But I don't know what his journey was like. But for me, that was pretty much it. And I was so broken at that point that I allowed my parents to match me to somebody. Now, I say match, and I mean that kind of vaguely, because there was like a very specific, like, you would announce the matching, you would have pictures taken, it would go up on the website. From my perspective, we were just talking. He and I were getting to know each other. Someone had suggested the match to my parents. They had done no like getting to know him or anything. He was a complete unknown, and they were like, fine, all right, take her. And so like we went down to meet this family, and I was so horrified by this person. Like, he clearly did not give a shit about me being matched, nothing. And I was like, he wouldn't even talk to me really. And I was so broken by that point that I thought that that's what I deserved. Like, I thought that I was just so fallen and sinful and whatever. I'd internalized it so much that I thought that that was my punishment. But about 6 months later, I called my mother and I was like, I cannot marry this person. I just can't do it, because I couldn't articulate it at the time, but I recognized enough behaviors of his, of like being completely emotionally unavailable, that were similar to the way that my father behaved, that I was like, I will absolutely recreate my parents' marriage with this person. And my mom's response was that, well, you could break the matching if you wanted to. And those are like very loaded words, to break the matching, to break
I was wondering about that. Can you, once you've been matched, is it done? Or?
And so from my perspective, I was like, this was not official. We were just talking. Like, there were no photos taken. We didn't make any announcements to the community. Like, we were just sort of feeling this out. And her perspective was completely different. So that gave her more grounds to basically abuse me and talk about me like I was this fallen Eve and whatnot. And so again, she started sending me back into these reindoctrination scenarios, to the point where when the second generation department in New York City, which is like this central organization in the church, had an opening, she convinced me that I needed to go work there to basically like get my head on straight, to be like remoonified. And she had sent me to so many workshops too, that by that point I was indoctrinated enough to say yes. And that meant sleeping on the floor of a room with like 20 other women, being paid $100 a month, eating rice and kimchi, which is pickled cabbage, every day, being up at 6 a.m. in the office, doing the morning service every day, and then being locked in the building at 10 o'clock at night because we didn't have a key. And that was like my daily experience. And I thought that like I'd originally been told I would have my own room in like a dormitory style area. And so when I arrived,
wasn't in the brochure, was it?
This was not as advertised at all. And so when I asked about it, I was basically told that I was being selfish and, you know, all of the adjectives. And so again, it was like one more way that I just felt like I was terrible, not good, etc. And I had even called my mother in tears. Like I snuck into the office and I was like, Mom, I can't do this. And she's like, no, you need to set a condition for God. Like do it for 40 days. Cause again, the church was into numerology. So like 7, 21, 40, these are all providential numbers, 120. And so she's like, yeah, do it for 40 days or 3 months, which would have been 120 days, 90 days, whatever. And so, you know, that shamed me back into acquiescence. And the other missionaries, I don't know what was going on. I believe most of these women were Filipino, and they would be up at like 2:30 in the morning to go off on their mission. What were they doing? Did they have visas? Were these poor women being trafficked? I have no idea. But I was asking myself these questions as like my sleep was getting disrupted to the point where like I couldn't sleep through the night. So I started sneaking into my office and sleeping under my desk so that I wouldn't get woken up in the middle of the night by these women who would turn on the lights and turn on Celine Dion and chitter chatter as they got ready to go out to do whatever they were doing. And so if you project ahead 3 months of not enough sleep, not enough food, and being in this environment 24/7, I went home for Christmas / God's Day. So God's Day is the most important day in the church calendar, and it's New Year's Day. So it's a few days after Christmas. So I decided to spend that time with my family. And on the train ride home, I guess there had been an announcement that Moon was stepping up to match second generation again. And he was already in his 80s. So when I arrive home, my mother sits me down and she's like, Jenny, you know, here's the news. This might be the last time that Father does this. Who knows how long he's going to be alive? If Jesus came to you and said he had found your perfect spouse, what would you say to Jesus? Now, how much more is Father? So basically I was like, there was like no way out. I was sent down to the East Garden compound, which is the 18-acre compound in Irvington. And that is like, there is an iron gate there. You have to go through security. You drive through the compound. I was led into the ballroom of the conference center there, where I would spend the next 3 days eating, sleeping, being lectured to. But by the end of the first day, I was matched to a stranger. I didn't know it was going to be a blessing. I did not show up with a wedding dress, but by the end of 3 days, I was married to this stranger. And I fought every single day to get out. I was calling my parents, borrowing people's cell phones, begging for them to come pick me up. I was talking to leaders being like, I cannot do this. Holy shit. I don't want to be here. And eventually I got to like the top of the hierarchy, and he sits me down in this office and I gave him my full confession. I was like, this is what happened to my family. This is all of these things that I have struggles with. You know, I may not even be pure enough to be here.
Okay. I was wondering if you addressed that.
Oh, I addressed that. Yeah. And he looks at me and he goes, you know what I think? I think you're just chicken shit. And I burst into tears. I'm like, yes, I'm just chicken shit, which shows like just again, how indoctrinated I was. And so I ended that 3 days married to a complete stranger from another country who didn't speak very good English.
Man, doesn't it just show they don't even really care about their own rules, you know, as far as, you know, you should have been unclean or, you know, not good enough or whatever because of potential abuse. They don't even, it's all about just moving you down the line. You know? And here's the next step, and it's time for you to get married. And I know we talked a little bit again pre-interview, I believe, about the marriage process, being matched with someone. Like, you're not guaranteed that you get someone who even speaks the same language.
No, not at all.
Or I mean,
or speaks any English if you're an native English speaker. Yeah, there were people who like their spouse would be Japanese and their spouse didn't speak any English. And this is both first and second generation went through this. There were people who were at my matching, and again, this was a very common practice, who didn't even get matched to another human being. They were matched to a picture that was there as a proxy. So there were some girls in wedding dresses who were getting married with a picture.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
that is rough.
That wasn't even my worst nightmare growing up. My worst nightmare was getting matched to a dead person because, yeah. So Moon's third son, I think, died in a car accident before he had been able to get matched and blessed. And this created a theological issue because if Moon was preaching that the reason that Jesus didn't complete his mission is because he didn't get married and have blessed children, then the fact that his son died before he got matched and blessed was a problem. So he matched the daughter of his secondhand man to the spirit of his son. And so I grew up in a world where women were blessed to dead people for the most part. It was Korean women. So like at Belvedere, the compound that was somewhat adjacent to East Garden, in the mansion, like we were told that Jesus's wife lived there. She's this little old Korean lady who had been married to Jesus, and women were getting married to like Confucius and stuff. Yeah.
Wait, wow.
Yes. And so I had nightmares about being blessed to a dead person.
Wow.
Yeah.
And did you say, I believe you said it was Korean women who were being forced to marry more often than not the deceased individuals.
So the way there may have been people of other nationalities, but in terms of the ethnic hierarchy, Koreans were the top.
Well, that's what I figured. And so, therefore,
and so,
Confucius, Jesus.
Right. Because these are saints, I think that it was looked at as this like great honor to be married to these people. And so I believe that it was mostly Korean women that were married to them. I don't know if any dudes married dead women, but I think it was mostly Korean women marrying the saints.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So you at least were paired with a live human being.
Yeah, at least I had a live human being. Yeah.
Though I don't know, depending on how that goes, the alternative might be better. As far as, a picture or not a picture, but a deceased individual, because maybe then I guess you wouldn't have the abuse or whatever if
right.
This was really bad.
And so I spent 2 years trying to fight my way out of this marriage. And there was this, there were no boundaries in the church. Like people would come up to me and ask me like, have you started family yet? Which means, have you consummated the marriage? Because again, family is the center of the church. And even my spouse at the time was pressuring me into sex. I had no language around consent. I had no language around intimacy. And so I was fighting it. And he'd be like, why don't you want to be affectionate with me? And I think the first time I'd even ever heard anybody like dart around issues of consent was at the same workshop that I told you about when I was 14. We would have these things called blessing Q&A panels where you would be allowed to ask questions basically about sex. So you'd like write your anonymous question on a piece of paper and it would go up to this panel of older second generation who were already matched and blessed. And one of the questions was like, when is it okay to start family? And the girl that answered said, it took me time to start family with my husband because I didn't trust him. And when he asked me why I didn't want to have sex with him, I said, because I don't know you very well and I haven't developed trust with you. And to me, that was like, what? I didn't even know how to process that, but it was something that resonated with me as a 20-year-old with this stranger pressuring me into sex because I was like, I don't know you. I don't trust you. That feels like such a violation. And so we never did consummate the marriage, which was a huge issue for a lot of people. But I was having nightmares for years about being raped because in my emotional and mental experience, it was a form of sexual abuse, that somebody was telling me that they had a right to my body. And that was in the theology too. Like, we were taught that the husband is the owner of the woman's sexual organ, and the woman owns the man's sexual organ. And so for a man who says, you know, I'm your husband, you're supposed to submit to me, and me to say no, it was very problematic.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Jehovah's Witnesses like the scripture that talks about rendering to each one his or her. Well, I'm not sure. I think it just says his due, which I would not be surprised if that's what the scripture says. I'd have to go look, but it's, you know, rendering. It might say render to each one their due. But usually when you heard it mentioned from a platform, it was basically, wives, you need to render to your husband their due. That's how it was usually mentioned. It wasn't vice versa. And so there's always going to be that structure. I just want to say, good for you. Like, that must have taken some strength for you to, you said no. And that's very difficult in these situations. We're taught our whole lives not to say no, to say yes and go along with, and to submit, in, you know, male or female, to the teachings that we're indoctrinated with. So for you to be able to say that shows a lot of strength.
I think the experience of Moon matching me was the most terrifying experience that I had ever had, because even from the time I was 12, like, I'd only met Moon a few times, and I'd been in his presence for like speeches and things. But the first time I ever shook his hand, I was 12. And we had been taught that touching Reverend Moon was like this ecstatic experience, that every cell in your body would come alive with joy and whatnot. And he can see into your soul, and he can see, you know, 7 generations down the line, and see your ancestry, and, you know, all of the things. And when I shook his hand, I didn't feel anything. And I thought it was my fault. I thought something was wrong with me. And that's how I interpreted everything. And so the moment that I'm standing there in front of him in this sweltering ballroom, it's like 2 a.m. and he's just pointing to people. There's this part of me that's trying to ground myself in the indoctrination. We were taught absolute faith, absolute love, absolute obedience. And so I'm like repeating that to myself as this mantra. But when he pointed at me, I was like reaching out, trying to feel some sort of spark of connection, because this is a man that has my entire future in his hands at this moment. And I felt like he wasn't even looking at me. I felt like he was just looking through me. I wasn't even there. And it felt like I don't know, like a trap door had opened underneath my feet. Like, the horror that I felt was just so indescribable. And so I think for me, that was like the true inner self coming fully online to be like, what the fuck's going on here? And it, you know, it flickered in and out over the next 2 years, but it became this thing for me. Like, I have to get out. And no matter like what the consequences were, I don't care if my father beats me, if my parents kick me out, whatever. Like, again, I was working for the church, and I moved to another organization afterwards because I got fired for trying to get out of the matching. They didn't want me in the second gen department anymore.
I'm not surprised.
My boss came up to me and was like, I think you need to work on yourself.
You're not being submissive. I get it.
Okay. Yeah. So I was working for another church organization doing conferences, and I was like sleeping in the closet of my office because I didn't want to go home because there was so much pressure. Like, I did everything that I could to just extract myself from that situation, because I think in that moment, it was just like, I realized that this inner self that I had been suppressing over the years would die if I continued on this path. Like, it was just this crossroads for me where I didn't know if I'd be able to keep alive the thing that I was not fully sure even what it was, but I knew that this was something that would break me, and I couldn't let it happen. To circle back, you know, we were sent out on this labor trafficking thing when I had graduated high school. It was called STF, or Special Task Force. And this was this other thing that I recognized at the time as a teenager. We were supposed to live in a van for a year and fundraise. So like literally sleep in a van. and then spend a year witnessing and then, go out on a mission and things like that. I recognized even at like 16, 17, that this was something that was designed to break us down. But I didn't have the foundation or the understanding of who I was to be able to get out of it and escape it.
Sure.
But at 20, when I was faced with like, this is going to be your marriage partner, and the blessing is considered eternal. So it's not like, an earthly, like, well, you could be miserable on earth, but at least you get rid of that person in heaven. No, this was eternal. I was like, I can't do this. And so for me, when I broke the blessing, about 2 years later, I still considered myself a failure. I had left the church, but I didn't leave it with this conviction that, this is wrong and I'm right. It took me many years of undoing that doctrination and then, educating myself about the group to understand that, like, oh, wait a minute, that was like, a healthy ego that was trying to protect me and things like that. It took me a long time to dismantle the feeling of having failed.
That is so common.
Yeah.
So many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. So I have a different story. I woke up first and left.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people leave for a behavioral reason, let's say, and they're kicked out, and they don't know that they're actually right probably about a lot of things if they were to think about it or give any credence to their doubts, and start looking further. So a lot of people live in witness language. We would call that POMI, physically out, mentally in. There are a lot of people that are physically have left, but mentally they still are kind of attached and believe it, and just believe that they are bad people. They couldn't hack it. They're, it's that instead of, guilt is I did a bad thing, shame is I am a bad person. And many feel shame and they feel tremendously shamed internally that they're just such bad people that can't live up to the one and only true, path, instead of being able to give themselves any grace or even have what it takes to look into what they have been involved in and for all those years, because that's just such a scary thing to do. And there was a lot of language about not reading apostate material or anything on the outside. It was trickery from the devil and things like that. So what was it for you? So did you just feel when you left? Well, first of all, how did you leave?
So it was a long process. And I think that, again, it was like, if you look at my leaving process, it's sort of like these little spikes on a graph. The first time I think about leaving, I'm 14, and then I'm, this age and this age. And so I had been on the verge of leaving at 19 before getting sucked back in and then working for the second generation department and then getting blessed. And so I fought with my parents every day. They threatened me every day. All of the shameful, slut shaming kind of language that you can imagine came from my mother.
And this was when you were married?
This is when I was married. My mother
You're not even consummating the relationship.
I was still a virgin. Yeah.
Right, but yet you're being called these names.
My mother asked me if I had been unfaithful to my partner because I was struggling so much.
Okay.
And so again, like, struggle was a sign of my being bad. It wasn't a sign that there was a problem. And so it took me 2 years before so we were not legally married. He was from Norway. I was from the United States. So neither the United States nor Norway would have recognized our union, but we were taught to believe that, church law was more important than secular law. And I knew that if I didn't get essentially like a church divorce, that his parents would never stop hounding me. He would never stop hounding me, and my parents wouldn't. Because he would call me, his parents would call me, his siblings would call me and be like, "Why aren't you giving our brother love?" So, I was getting it from all sides.
Goodness.
Yeah. It was
was he present when you all were married, or was that a picture?
He was present. Yeah, okay. He had flown over from Norway. He stayed for a while afterwards. And then I had gone to visit him. He came to visit me. One of the reasons that I worked for a church organization doing conferences is that it kept me moving from country to country and city to city. So I had excuses not to see him and excuses not to be home too. It was like this safe haven. And my boss was very unique. He was the second generation. in that he said in our department, nobody was allowed to ask each other about each other's blessing, because I think that he knew, like, he was in a leadership position. He had like 4 kids and was married in the church. So he was certainly upholding the structure of the church, but I think that he knew that enough people were struggling, even under his own purview, that to have that lack of boundaries, to be asking people those personal questions, made it an unsafe space. We didn't have the language of safe space or unsafe space. It was just his rule. You don't ask anybody about their blessings. And so I used that again as like this haven to keep me kind of in transit, just in liminal spaces for a long time, so that I had an excuse not to go to couples counseling in Prague with him and couples counseling in Denmark. Like, he was always asking me to come to these workshops and come to counseling. And he's like, I want to help you be better. And I was like, oh, don't. And I found out later too, that the leader that I had given my full confession to said that he was going to go to this guy and tell him everything that I had said, so that this guy could have the information about whether or not he wanted to accept me. Turns out he didn't tell him anything. And so this poor guy, who was a nice person, younger than me by a couple of years, I think he was still like in high school. So I'm 20, he's like last year of high school. So there's a lot of emotional difference, cultural difference. And so, for me, he felt like this younger brother who was also asking me for like inappropriate sexual favors. But overall, like a decent human being. From his perspective, he was probably like, what the hell is going on? This girl's probably a psycho, because I'm trying to process all of this trauma that's suddenly in my face in a very real way. And I thought that he knew. And so I felt as though his behavior was like additionally problematic. And so it kind of came down to my mother got sick. She had Lyme disease. And then shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with cancer. So I quit my job to become her caretaker. And he wanted to come out. He wanted to move to America. And I kept rebuffing him. So he's like, well, at least let me visit. The first time when she had Lyme disease, I was like, I can't, like, I'm giving my mother daily injections. I can't deal with it. And then there was another time he wanted to come out that didn't work. And then when she had been diagnosed with cancer, I said no, and both of my parents said no, and he came anyway. So he just showed up. And that's when I was like, we are done. You are coming with me to the seminary. We are going to sign the paperwork now. Because to me, that was just such a huge violation. And my mother believed, so the church believed that all forms of sickness, mental, emotional, physical, were caused by evil spirits invading. My mother believed that my breaking the blessing was the reason that she had gotten cancer.
Oh no.
Yeah. But still, even at that point, I was like, I can't handle this. I'm not, like, to me, even more so than putting pressure on me for sex, that violation of me saying, this is a really difficult time. I don't know, like, I'm going to be caretaking for my mother who's going through chemo. I can't handle your presence. I can't host you. For him to ignore that and be like, I'm your husband, you listen to me. I was like, no, we are like, there's no way to work that out. And so the day before my 22nd birthday, I signed the paperwork and he signed the paperwork. And even after that, he was like, are we over? Like, he still didn't understand, and it still took time. So I stayed in my parents' home until my mother had finished chemo and radiation, and then I moved out. And I lied and said that I had a college degree and got a newspaper job, and that's how I supported myself.
A newspaper job?
As a reporter with a local newspaper.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't feel awesome because I was lying. They're like, so where did you go to school? And I was like, New Paltz. I didn't have a degree.
Right, but like you're obviously a very articulate person and have probably the personality to be a great reporter.
I loved it. It was a great job.
That's cool.
Was so healthy for me. I mean, the paper folded shortly thereafter, but it was definitely a healthy foundation for me. I also was involved in local theater too. So I had a community that I kind of transitioned into, and the theater. Like, theater people are some of the most supportive people that you will ever meet. They have borne a lot of trauma, many of them too, artists in general. And so, very understanding people. Like, the theater director was the kind of guy that he would let kids sleep in the green room if they were having problems. I never got to that point, but I knew of kids who were like, you know, learning lighting design at the theater, who were like runaways, who were sleeping there, kind of a thing. And so I had, luckily, that to sort of transition into a little bit. But the thing that really started to help me with my deconstruction was a website called How Well Do You Know Your Moon? And what it does is it has like documentation on who Reverend Moon really is, and, you know, various things in the church. And I read it obsessively. And it's run by an anonymous group of people who, you know, I think they've been threatened by the church because the things that they reveal are so incendiary. But for me, reading it really helped me to understand my experience. And then, of course, graduating from there to learn about what a high demand group is, and literature from various experts like Alexandra Stein, who talks about, you know, attachment models and cults, John Jalalich's Take Back Your Life, various books like that. Then I was able to really understand my experience and develop language for the experience.
I'm guessing, so you said it was called How Well Do You Know Your Moon?
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna have to look that up. I'll link it in the show notes, just in case anyone who's listening wants to go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like it's kind of so we have one as witnesses called JWFacts.com, and it's so much information there about, and it's really their information, you know, and helping deconstruct that with their own stuff. It's really helpful to do so. Do you all have anything? I don't know. Is there a podcast or anything that
there is now? So this is relatively new. One Second Generation has started the Falling Out podcast. So I think it's fallingoutpodcast.com. And right now there's only 3 interviews up. They're each 2 parts. So it's 6 parts. I'm actually going to be talking to the podcaster tomorrow, kind of sharing similar stories. And then there's another one that was released in 2019 called Growing Up Moony. And it's more short form. I think there's 8 episodes. And so those are incredible resources, because one of the things that I think a lot of us who've, again, grown up in these high demand groups where there's a lot of gaslighting and a lot of indoctrination, we doubt our own experiences. And so when I hear these stories, I'm like, oh shit, that happened to me too. Or they said that to me too. This wasn't just a fever dream. Like, that happened. And it really helps solidify for me to trust my own experience. So if there's anybody listening who grew up in the Unification Church, those are 3 amazing resources for sure.
One of my favorite quotes is, "A man with an experience is not at the mercy of a man with an opinion."
There you go.
And we all have an experience, and being able to share it openly. And I love that you're on here. I mean, I know I typically interview ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. Those are my people. That's where I came from. And so, you know, there's a communication there that's easy, and we understand one another. But there's also, you know, I've had interviews with the FLDS, Mennonites, Amish, lots of other groups. Also, you know, now Scientology, and I think we just, again, can all learn from one another. We've all been through so many similar experiences, and I remember for myself, it was important when I started to learn that there were other groups like that too. I started to see that that this is just something that is done in life to people at times in different ways, and it really helped me to see that. You know, I always thought, as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, we were always taught that we were special, we were chosen,
of course,
we were the only ones, right? And then you start to see, no, we weren't that special, and it's just another one of these types of groups, and it's just another narrative attached to the same mechanisms, and it makes you feel less alone. And
it does.
So much of our experience was to make us feel alone.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I think it's the Bright Eyes lyrics. When I heard these, I'm happy just because I found out I'm really nobody. I was like, oh, I resonate with that so much. I mean, it's hard to lose your special status. It's hard to lose your secret identity for some of us. And yet at the same time, being able to give yourself permission to just be a normal person is such a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you would like to let people know about the group that, anything that you think people should know?
I think that the most important thing for a lot of us in our deconstruction or when we're on the cusp is that, really looking at Moon's actions versus what he said is really important because we had been taught to justify everything, again, going back to there's this theological explanation for everything. But when you see how Moon lived versus what he spoke of, I think that that dissonance is really important to examine. And a lot of us feel it and a lot of us recognize it and suppress it. And so if I were speaking to somebody who was thinking about leaving, or if I was speaking to my younger self, I would really say, like, trust that intuition and trust your gut and look for those facts. And so, again, a place like How Well Do You Know Your Moon is a wonderful resource. You're not wrong. You're not a bad person. The way that they control you is, again, those shame-based techniques that you talked about, the shame being I am bad versus the guilt of I've done a bad thing. We were all controlled by shame, and learning to let go of that and heal it. It's a long process. When we learn about trauma and how it's stored in us for a long time, it's not going to be an overnight thing, but there is hope on the other side, and you can survive outside of the church.
Absolutely. You are on the outside of the church at
Yes,
this
I am.
point.
Yeah.
Do you see ways that life still impacts you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a long process of undoing. For anybody that is brought into a group like this at a young age or raised in it, that is your identity. You lose everything when you leave. I once said to my partner, I feel like I escaped from a country like the Soviet Union and I can never go back. It's behind the Iron Curtain. And, nobody speaks my mother tongue anymore. You are like a refugee in many regards. And so there's a complete new learning. Even though I did go to public school and I interacted with outside people, I had no healthy mechanisms. And so there's that whole relearning. And you have to be very gentle with yourself, and it takes time. And it's difficult when you're not taught healthy relationships. Being able to be in a long-term relationship requires a lot of learning and a lot of forgiveness of self and a lot of communication, feeling your feelings. So yeah, it's an everyday thing. It gets easier every day. It was really hard in the beginning, but it is possible.
Yeah. And I think that relationship with self is one of the most important things we were never allowed to have. We were never allowed to have a relationship and develop our own identity with ourselves.
Yes. Right. And so then you lose that almost lack of identity when you leave, and you have to rebuild at however old you are from the beginning. And one thing that I say a lot of times is, like, if somebody who had come into our church, for example, in our parents' generation, if they left, there was the pre-cult identity to return to. And that is a difficult enough process, but there is zero identity for us when we leave. And so you have to be so gentle with yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think learning about how to reparent ourselves is also a process that I'm undergoing. And I think it'll be a lifelong thing, but I think that it's possible.
Absolutely. So today you are shunned, right? And what happened to your past relationships? When you left, like you said, there's no formal process. Did your leaving just initiate everyone just starts to distance themselves?
People distanced themselves as soon as they knew I was struggling with my blessing. People distanced themselves in the past too, because our family secret was not a good secret. So there was layers of shunning for sure. I became more and more of an outsider. Today, I think that people would, if they thought that they could reconvert me, they would be happy to have me back. But there was definitely, like, my sister fell when she was 16 and she was completely excommunicated. Like, people told her, you have the spirit of a prostitute and things like that. So I think that had I tried to reintegrate after breaking my blessing, it would have been, I mean, again, I would have been a second class citizen, and there would have been so many layers of penance and things like that to go through to continue to be a second class citizen. I'm one of the rare people in that my parents didn't completely cut me off. My mother has since passed, and she remained abusive to the end of her days, as did my father in his ways. But they still tried to keep somewhat of a relationship because they wanted to pull me back in. But there are people that have lost their entire families because of it.
Of course. Your younger brothers, are they still in, or?
I don't think so. But two of them still live with my father. And so they're sort of under the structure of the church. Yeah.
Okay. If you could say anything to, those who shun you today, is there anything you would say to them?
Probably not.
What's that? Probably not. Because there's no use, especially
right.
They're not going to listen, most likely.
Yeah.
And they're just trying to get you back.
Yeah. I mean, if it was somebody who was actively shunning me, they're just going to talk at me to try to, like, they're going to lecture me with divine principle and tell me how much they love me and things like that. But it's a conditional love. And so for me, there would be no reason to have that conversation. If it was somebody that was struggling who wanted to leave the church, I would absolutely have a conversation with them. And I would tell them all the things that I said I'd say to my past self, but not anybody in the church who was, still very much a Moonie, as it were.
Once you leave, and how long have you been out now?
So I think I've been out 15 years at this point.
Okay, 15 years. So you learn a lot of lessons.
Yeah.
As you're going through this process of waking up to the realities of everything, finding yourself, all of that. Mm-hmm. Is there one important thing that you've learned that you'd like to share that might help somebody else?
I mean, it's not an easy lesson, but I think developing boundaries is really important because we had no boundaries. We were so permeable growing up. We had to report all of our thoughts and feelings. We weren't allowed to have any kind of inner life. And so it's very easy to take that into the quote outside world as you're transitioning. And that can make you vulnerable to people that you probably don't want to interact with. And it can really put off people who do have healthy egos and healthy boundaries. And so learning about that, I think, is a way to, like, really practice self-care and to respect yourself. Again, it's not an overnight thing. It's something I'm still learning. But it's been one of, I think, the most valuable things for me to understand they're a thing and I can set them. And that, they are, like, when I get angry about something, that's a healthy part of me asserting that a boundary has been violated and I'm allowed to have them and I'm allowed to protect them. And I think it's a really beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can see you tried to assert boundaries.
You did.
You did try.
Did.
It's just, it doesn't go well. It's hard to have a high demand, high control organization or group, mm-hmm. And have people have boundaries. I mean, it's all about breaking down boundaries.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's a beautiful thing to learn. So, what do you love about your new life, and is there anything that you want going forward?
I mean, I love the fact that I'm in a place where this doesn't define me anymore. I love that I can explore my interests. I love that I can talk about this too as a way of helping other people who are like me. Because if I had had resources like this as a younger person, I might have been able to get out earlier. I love being in a healthy relationship with a supportive partner. I love having healthy friendships. And I just love learning about myself. And I think that can sound really self-centered, is a word that we used a lot growing up. But I think it's a beautiful thing that those of us that were denied that opportunity as a child to give ourselves that space to learn about ourselves, to learn about our passions, to develop them. These are things that I think are wonderful. And I'm so grateful to have that space in my life now.
That's awesome. Self-care is not selfish.
No, and
You know?
it's still hard for me to separate those in my mind, but I'm working on it.
Well, that's excellent. I'm so glad that you reached out and we could have this conversation, because I think that it's important for, obviously a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses listen to this, but I have people who are just, products of narcissistic families. Mm-hmm. And they reach out and say, hey, I love these stories because I can see so many similarities. I can learn things, mm-hmm. Boundaries, that's such an important thing. People who have gone through so many different experiences, and the Unification Church certainly has its own unique set of circumstances or verbiage or things that went on. But I'm just glad that you reached out to tell it. I hope that someday somebody finds this, that it that helps them in their awakening process.
Me too.
To be able to do that faster. Be the person that you wish you had when you were leaving. And it sounds like you're doing.
Yes. I think that is the most beautiful tenet to live by.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate you doing this.
I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you for having me.